The George Wright Society is delighted to welcome to our conference the noted science journalist and author Emma Marris. She's a key figure in a robust debate that has gotten a lot of attention recently, whether the human domination of Earth is necessarily a bad thing. She's a freelance writer based in Columbia, Missouri, and holds a master's degree in science writing from Johns Hopkins University. Marris publishes on a wide range of topics. Her work has appeared in Conservation, Wired, the New York Times, and in the journal Nature, where she was a staffer for several years. It is her 2011 book, Rambunctious Garden, however, that has captured the attention of environmental journalists and the conservation community. There, she argues that as humans change every centimeter of Earth, from what species live where to its very climate, our strategies for saving nature must change. And she offers specific ideas on how conservationists must give up cherished but outdated ideas and learn to embrace without regret our strange, beautiful, and totally humanized planet. Yesterday, we heard a pointed defense of traditional-based conservation from Dr. Michael Soule. Today, we will hear a very different point of view. Our plan is to have Ms. Marris speak for about 35 or 40 minutes, with the rest of the session devoted to questions from both our live and audience and those watching on webcast. This question and answer period will be moderated by one of my fellow GWS board members. Now, please join me in providing a warm welcome to Emma Marris.
Hello, thanks so much. Thanks so much for inviting me, and thanks so much to Dave Harmon for dealing with the craziness that has been his life probably for the past couple of months. The amount of sort of enthusiasm and happiness he exudes after dealing with all that is amazing. Yeah, definitely. And thanks so much to all of you and to everyone who's watching online for what you do, the amazing job that you do. I was thinking a little bit about your job and how interesting it is, and how to many people who haven't really thought very hard about it and maybe just go to parks once a year on vacation, your job is sort of a paradox, because they think that parks are the only places that aren't managed, and then here's an entire room full of people that manages them. So I think it's very interesting what you do. It's a sort of a secret job in a way. All right, so today I'm going to talk about intervention, which is what we're all interested in. How much to intervene, where to intervene, when to intervene, why to intervene. Are we intervening right now? My argument is that we are. As we sit here, we're all intervening. So my book that was mentioned in the introduction came out of several years of reporting on conservation science and ecology for the journal Nature. I started that job around 2005, and in the 5 or 6 years that I worked on it intensively, the sort of biggest trends that I thought were coming out of the science was that ecosystems were more dynamic than we thought, that pre-European influences on ecosystems were bigger than we thought, and that contemporary human influences were mind-bogglingly big, and an interesting feeling out of new conservation approaches that weren't oriented towards historical baselines. I thought that was really interesting, and that was really the focus of my book. So the first third is kind of explaining to the lay reader why historical baselines might not be as helpful in the future as they have been for us in the past. And the second 2/3 were about these new tools. So I'm going to zoom through the argument really briefly. I think the starting place for a lot of lay people thinking about nature is that it is an unspoiled, untouched, timeless place, a Garden of Eden, that is also incredibly fragile, and the minute a human being touches it or plucks an apple, the whole thing goes to hell. This kind of narrative is so powerful in our culture that even though I don't think anyone who's trained in conservation science or land management has ever really even been explicitly told this by their teachers, it's in all of our hearts somewhere. But what we've been learning more and more as we cope with the changes to the earth, and as we learn more and more about paleoecology and about how ecosystems have changed through time is that we can't go back to this Garden of Eden, and this Garden of Eden never really existed in the first place. You can't go home, and there was no home to go to. The idea that when Columbus stepped off the boat, the place, North America, was a virgin wilderness has obviously been pretty thoroughly debunked, but it still often seems to hang around as a cultural narrative. Obviously, when I give talks to garden clubs and public libraries, I spend a lot of time talking about how people managed the land before Europeans got here, how they burned and how they designated hunting zones and non-hunting zones, and how they had widespread agriculture, and how they fertilized the soil, and how some of their land management techniques were easy to overlook at first because they're different than ours. Maybe more like planting certain varieties of trees inside the matrix of a forest, or planting certain edible plants inside the matrix of a grassland, rather than clearing everything away and starting sort of from the rocks up. But it was land management nonetheless. And then I spent a lot of time talking about the big changes to North America before going back thousands of years to the Pleistocene, when large-scale extinctions of large animals changed the whole face of the continent. This is one of my favorite, this is the only graph in my talk. I love this one from Anthony Barnowski and his group at Berkeley. They show human population on the same graph as these extinctions throughout the world of large animals. There's just a lot fewer large animals left now than there used to be, and there's a lot more of us. One could be forgiven from looking at this graph and just sort of having this picture of us just eating them all and getting bigger. And that's more or less what we did. He's got a very similar graph that's this story just on biomass terms, that as we, and I think this science kind of hints that it's us, that it's we who caused these extinctions. We got more numerous, and we started taking more of the energy of the planet for our own uses. And so our biomass grew and the biomass of our livestock grew at the expense of the reduced biomass of all of these large animals, the sloths, the mastodons, the saber-toothed cats, and other large creatures. So, of course, when these big guys go extinct, it's not like we can just pluck them off the diorama of North America. There's ripple effects throughout the ecosystem. Things that were grassland turned to forests. Forests changed tree compositions. And paleoecologists are doing a lot of work teasing out these ripple effects. I'm especially following the work of Jacqueline Gill at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, who does a lot of pollen work, looking at lakes and so on. She's done cool stuff looking at the little guys that used to eat all the dung of these big, huge animals, and you can see their population crashes at certain points. So the ecosystems of North America that we all see as being Edenic are obviously the product of human management and human mismanagement. So I spent a lot of time trying to find that Eden in my research. I kept calling guys up and saying, well, okay, what about if you go to the day before the first person stepped on North America? Maybe that could be our baseline that we could all try to manage to. But of course, if you go to the day before the first human stepped in North America, it looks like this, and everything is different. I mean, Parks Canada would have a hard time, I think, managing to these conditions. So, and then I learned that, even if we had never come, maybe we could run computer models and we could figure out what it would look like now in North America if we had never shown up. But it's sort of impossible to know because it's not like everything would have just stayed still. People like Stephen Jackson have shown that there's probably no ecosystem in North America that's been really stable for more than about 12,000 years. So even if we weren't here, things would have happened, changes, processes, things would have moved around, things would have evolved. And who knows what kind of condition would obtain today. So there's your historical baseline. I mean, I tried, but I just can't see it. I just can't find that perfect day, that, June 3rd, 13,000 years ago, that we can all see as the right state, the right time. So what do you do with this information? I mean, the first thing is you feel a little lost. Now, this is a part of a graph from a paper that just came out in Restoration Ecology like 2 days ago from Richard Hobbs. And in it, he talks about why there is this polarization between sort of these nouveau environmentalists and sort of more conservative conservationists. And his theory is that we're just in different parts of the cycles of grief. We're dealing with a lot of environmental problems in our planet. And they're not pretty and they're not fun to deal with professionally day in and day out. And they take a toll. And so we cycle through the stages of grief. And his feeling is that perhaps those of us who are more interested in some of these new tools and talking about this stuff, we're in the acceptance phase. Whereas on other days, I will admit to being in the depression phase, although malt whiskey is not my choice of coping mechanism. Hot baths and gin and tonics maybe would be what I would go for. So let's spend a couple of minutes in the acceptance phase. If this is the case, if we can't go home, what can we do? This was the starting point for my book, which is available for a low, low price right outside after the old goal was so neat. You know, everything was right. Just any possible goal you might have was easily achieved by looking to history. Beauty. It was more beautiful back then. Function. Oh, it functioned perfectly back then. Biodiversity. Totally diverse back then. Let's just put it back. So now we have to pick a goal. We can't just, so we have to pick a goal and we have to manage to that. And picking goals is complicated and messy and we can disagree, but unfortunately this is where we are. This is the condition we're in now. We have to look forward and pick a goal. So here are some possible goals. One thing I did not do in my book is tell anybody which goal is right or correct or which one they ought to vote for, because I'm not, first of all, I'm a journalist, right? I'm not supposed to be telling people what to do. But also, I don't know. I mean, these are very complex questions that speak to our values as people, and I think it's going to be a mix, right? And that's never a very satisfying answer. You kind of want there to be one formula for everything, but there's not going to be one. There's going to be, in some places, biodiversity is going to be a clear, obvious, good goal. In other places, we might take a more services approach, and in other places, we might want some of these more nuanced goals that I've got listed near the bottom here, including things like wildness or fear. One thing that I want to make clear is that the idea of picking a goal and managing to it does not mean that we deny the intrinsic value of nature. One of the goals is to protect the intrinsic value of nature. It just might be in a slightly different place than we're used to seeing it. So we're already kind of doing all this. We're already picking goals and managing to them. I'm sure that in your jobs, you're not saying, okay, let's have a meeting and get out a calendar and pick a date to manage to. That's not actually how it works operationally. These goals, different suites and shades of goals, are already how we kind of pragmatically organize our management. So what is new here? I gave a talk about my work in the Netherlands, and they just looked at me like, what's new? What's new about this? This is how nature, this is how we do it. Well, what's new, I think, is a psychological shift from seeing picking these goals and using these new tools as second best. We have to do it. Last ditch. I'd rather put it back, but seeing as I can't, I'll do this. Instead of seeing these as these sort of triage-y, hospice nursing kind of moves, we need to get more positive about them and say, okay, let's make more nature. Let's go out and make more green things. Let's put more plants and animals on the landscape. Let's bring some joy to this endeavor instead of seeing these strategies as sad, last-ditch attempts. So this is kind of why I wanted to this is why I use the gardening metaphor in my book. Gardening means caring for all species, and it's like stewardship in my mind, except a steward could just be some guy with some account somewhere or some keys to the wine cellar. He doesn't necessarily have to do anything except make sure nobody screws with the stuff he's watching. But a gardener can't just leave it alone. A gardener does have to go out and get dirty and get down in the soil and intervene in order to properly garden. You can't always garden just by looking out the back window. So we don't garden in order to reduce wildness. Although some interventionist safe species will inevitably require reducing wildness. Think about any time any scientific study of wildlife uses radio collars or other tracking devices. There's a clear way in which a big bear with a huge radio collar around its neck is less wild to us than a bear without one. Well, we know where it is, for one thing, and it's got a number and so on. But these reductions in wildness we have deemed to be necessary in order for the long-term survival of the bear and his relatives. So I think that as gardeners we can certainly have wildness, but it's going to look unfamiliar, as we're going to see. So what do we do when we garden? We do a lot of the things that we're already doing. We make corridors, we try to increase the size of protected areas, we try to make more green stuff, but we do it with joy. All right, so here's some of the new tools that we can use if we're not too hung up on history. The first is assisted migration, which I think is the biggest test case for your intuitions about this stuff. So in assisted migration, you've got a guy like this pika here who is not going to be happy in his current range as the climate warms. In his most simple hypothetical formulation, you can either leave the pika where he is and watch him go extinct, or you can move the pika out of his natural range and create an invasive species. So what do you want to do? Be party to an extinction or create an invasive? That's sort of the conundrum that you put in. And I guess I come down on the side of let's make an invasive. Like, I think it's more important to have these guys than to be puritanical about where they are. Another possible tool you have is using proxies and other kind of surrogates in ecosystems. This is a guy named Frans Vera. He is an ecologist in the Netherlands, and he runs this really cool wildlife refuge there called the Oostvaardersplassen, which you may have heard of. There was actually a piece in the New Yorker about it in December, and I did a piece about it in 2009. He wanted to create a landscape in the Netherlands that was as close as he could to what he thinks the Netherlands looked like in the Pleistocene. And his own theories, which are not, I must hasten to add, 100% accepted by all ecologists in Europe, in his theories, it's a savanna system dominated by big grazers. So he needed a bunch of big grazers. But the problem is that most of the big grazers that would have been around there are extinct. This is like the last European wild horse. They're not around anymore. So he got these. These are some Polish breeds of horses that are very similar. And he went to Poland with a big truck, and he bought a whole bunch of these guys, and he brought them back, and he let them loose. And there would have been aurochs running around. Unfortunately, the last one was shot in Poland in the 1600s. So he got these guys, which are a breed of cattle called Heck cattle, which have been intentionally bred to look like aurochs and potentially act like aurochs. Who knows? It's kind of a weird breeding program. But it's an interesting surrogate. And then he threw a bunch of red deer on there, too, because they would have been around. So he puts all these grazers on the landscape, and what do? They graze it into this, amazing-looking grassland. And it looks pretty wild, pretty out of there. It's not the kind of landscape you expect to see in the Netherlands, that's for sure. And he's had some good success with it. One thing that really freaks out the Dutch, though, is that the notion that if something dies, you let it lie there, so to create further opportunities for scavengers and other parts of the ecosystem. For the Dutch, letting like a big animal corpse just lie around on the ground is pretty horrifying. And they've been accused of animal cruelty and brought up on charges of animal cruelty and all sorts of things. But it seems to be doing some really interesting, there seems to be some really interesting successes. So he's had these raptors and other birds that have been missing in the Netherlands for hundreds of years just show up. Something about the ecosystem that he has created has spoken to these animals, and they have returned. These eagles, I think they're called Whitetailed Eagles, when these guys showed up, he was thrilled. He's a birder at heart, and this was, to him, the sort of vindication of all of his ideas. So what do we have? We have, is it a wild area? Is it a garden? Is it a garden about a wild area? I mean, it's filled with domesticated species that are just kind of let loose, and not to mention, it's all 12 feet below sea level and kept from the sea by a series of dikes. So it's hardly a pristine wilderness, and yet it has more of a wild flavor than anything else in the country. So I leave it to you to think about where sort of setups like these might have a place in future conservation and protected areas management. Okay, and this is the piece I wrote about. I mostly just throw this up to point out that mine came out in 2009. This is a novel ecosystem. So another thing, I've totally fallen in love with these novel ecosystems. And what does it mean to somebody who manages a protected area? Well, maybe that you probably have, some of you, something like this somewhere that you're worried about, because it's like a weed patch, basically. It's a bunch of invasive species hanging out together and playing house. And this one's in Hawaii. So this has trumpet trees from Mexico, strawberry guavas from Brazil, rose apples from Southeast Asia. It's got some hala in there, that's a native Hawaiian. It's got some Queensland maple from Australia. I mean, it's like Heathrow Airport. But they're all kind of getting along. They're cycling nutrients, they're sequestering carbon, they're making soil. And this grad student, Joe Mascaro, was out there measuring all this stuff, kind of flopping around in the bushes and going past old rusted out cars and stuff like that. I mean, these are not highly valued ecosystems at the moment. And he was finding that functionally, they look very similar to native ecosystems. As far, if you would just, biologist from Mars comes down, would he be able to tell that this is a non-native system? The diversity levels in some cases meet or exceed native systems. And as far as all the functions like nutrient cycling, they're kicking ass. So what are they? Should we go out there with a rototiller and mow the whole thing down? Should we put up a fence around it and say that it's a park? What should we do? Right now we're basically doing nothing with these, which I kind of think is actually smart, because what novel ecosystems can do is they can teach us a lot if we leave them alone, because they will show us what works in the changing Earth, right? We're pushing the Earth with all of these drivers. We're turning up the heat, we're moving things around, we're changing land use, and then we think that we know what nature wants, given all these conditions. It wants to be exactly the same as it was before we changed everything. But these systems might indicate that perhaps nature has a few it can adapt to this, it just looks different and weird to us. So part of this is a rethink of invasive species. Obviously the brown tree snake is bad. It kills all the forest birds in Guam. There's not going to be very many conservation goals where you're going to want the brown tree snake in Guam. And I'm sure everyone among us, if we could press a button and just nuke them all, we would have no hesitation. But in a lot of cases, exotics are not quite as horrible. They don't tend to cause extinctions in the same kind of scale that we used to think so, especially on continents. And they do occasionally have roles to play in ecosystems. So in Hawaii, for example, a lot of the native birds have gone extinct, and then there's all these fruit-bearing plants that have nobody to disperse their seeds. So then some non-native birds show up, and they start dispersing the seeds. Also, you may have heard about the case of salt cedar down in the Southwest. Non-native that everybody hated, we tried to pull it out, and then all of a sudden we noticed that the southwestern willow flycatcher was nesting in it, an endangered bird, and so suddenly we stopped pulling it out. So we need to think about, my basic message on exotics is ask questions first and then shoot. I'm all for shooting when it's, helps us further our goals, but when our goals are not furthered by removing non-natives, what's the point? All right. Here's another novel ecosystem that I really like, because this is a new lava flow this is new land that didn't exist before the 60s. And the first 3 things to colonize it were native ohia, with the red flowers there, Asian sword fern, and Australian ironwood. So the cool thing about this, not only do we have this, who knows what's going to happen with this system, what animals will come, what kind of other plants might show up, scientifically it's fascinating. But also, you can't even say that these guys are invasive because there was no land to invade, right? These were the first colonists. So, I forgot I put the turtle in. This is my newest example from Hawaii, and this was great. This is the Chinese bottleneck soft-shelled turtle, which is endangered in China, invasive in Kauai. So what do? Unfortunately, you can't just pick them all up and mail them back to China because they're very delicious in China, and they will be eaten in China. So what do? You take them out of Kauai and put them in a zoo, or what? So the researchers who are looking at this did a study about what this guy was eating. And they found out that you know, the freshwater systems of Hawaii are not super, super diverse naturally because of the challenges of having them be colonized from afar. So there weren't a whole lot of, they were eating all non-native things. They're eating like little trout and stuff like that. So they were like, well, it's a totally non-native food web. Maybe we should just let them hang out, you know? Homogenization is a real issue with this. I love these novel ecosystems because I find them personally compelling and because I find them to be the new wilderness. Places that look historically accurate to us are going to require more and more management as the climate changes, as the land use around them changes, and as the propagule pressure of exotic species continues to hammer the outside. So in order to keep something looking historical, we're going to need to do more and more gardening. If we want to stop gardening for 5 minutes, we're going to get novel ecosystems, and they will be self-willed. They may have species that were originally brought by humans to a new continent, but right now they are the self-willed places on Earth. They are the wild places. However, it is true that there is a threat that a lot of these wild places will look similar to one another, the homogenization problem. This is the McDonald's on the Big Island, where the fries taste exactly the same as the McDonald's here in Denver. There's no easy answer to this. I wish there was. In some cases, though, at least for a while, maybe we can conceptualize it less of homogenization and more of fusion cuisine. This is another dining option on the Big Island that takes culinary traditions from around the world and brings them together in an attractive and reasonably priced package. So it is because these kind of approaches, these kinds of tools, these ways of thinking, to me they are the antidote to despair. Now, it's easy to get a little bit too crazy, right? Personally, I think this is a great idea. You've got some invasive grass, it's driving fire cycles that you don't like. Bring in some elephants to eat the grass. I think people are pretty horrified by this because the elephant seems so big on the landscape, but in fact that's the genius of it, because if it all goes horribly wrong, it's not like a scale insect or something that you can't put back in the bottle. It's really easy to like remove elephants from a landscape. All you need is a helicopter and some ammunition. So it's a possible approach, but obviously you can't just go nuts with this stuff. You can't just try anything. And so I want to talk a little bit about humility. The biggest charge that I face when I'm talking about this stuff is that it's arrogant to say that humans control the Earth or that we can control the Earth. And so I just want to tease out those two claims right now because I'm only making one of them. To assert that we're in control of the Earth is overconfidence, right? It's the opposite of humility. We need to be humble. We need to realize that we are weak, we are short-lived, we are short-sighted, we are irrational, we are inept. And it's not only virtuous to be humble, but it's very smart because overconfidence can bring disaster. So when we say that we're in control of the Earth, it sounds classically overconfident. To say that we, on scales of like a city block or a farmer's field, certainly there seems like there's some level of control. But even there, I mean, the weeds will come up, the roots will throw the sewer system into disarray, and you park managers know that you can't control a piece of land in any sort of real and total sense. And on the global scale, it's clear that we have absolutely no idea what we're doing, right? I mean, it's not like there's some grand plan. It's not like we said, hey, let's change the climate and cover 75% of the Earth with agriculture. That sounds great. Let's do it, you know? It was an emergent thing that came out of all of us blundering around trying to do what was right for ourselves and our families. So we are not in control of the Earth. We are not masterminds of the Earth. We don't know what we're doing. But we are causally efficacious around the world. We do control the Earth in the sense that the weather controls the farmer's yield, or your insulin levels control your blood sugar, right? So we have this causal rule, but it's not a conscious masterminding. It's just a driving. So I'm not going to go over all the statistics that talk about how much we're in control of the Earth, because I'm sure that you've all heard them before. The scope of our control, the scope of our influence, right? Maybe influence is a better word than control, because it doesn't bring up this notions that we're somehow masterminding it or that we know what we're doing. But we are influencing it majorly, massively, majorly with climate change and with pollution and with land use change, especially land use change. You know, we're making nitrogen, we're doing all this sorts of stuff. So what do we do with that? So this is where we start talking about the Anthropocene, and people start throwing that word Anthropocene around. I'm going to check my time here. I think that there's 3 responses to the Anthropocene. Many people, especially more traditional conservationists, see the Anthropocene as a tragedy. Anthropocene equals bad, right away. And I can understand that because the Anthropocene has had a lot of negative effects. I mean, it's undeniable. But you can overdo it. I mean, when David Attenborough says that humans are a plague upon the earth, and when you go to meetings at the Ecological Society of America and they say that cities are cancers, I mean, this kind of thinking is, I don't think, necessarily going to rally everybody to conservation and get them really excited about it. So then there's the sort of technophile guy on the internet who says, oh, well, humans are natural, we're just another species, we're just like big beavers, so anything we do to the planet is therefore natural. And this is crazy, too, especially because these guys don't care anything about nature, and yet they're committing the naturalistic fallacy of assuming that anything that's natural is good. So, yeah, sure, humans are species. We're animals, just like everything else, and so at some level, everything that we do is natural. But just because, you know, a natural species proposes a pebble mine in Alaska does not mean that it is morally good to build the mine. So, I think most people probably share my understanding of the Anthropocene, which is that it has to be acknowledged, A, and that B, it is very troubling and worrisome because it has already caused a great many moral wrongs and many more loom. So in order to head off these further moral wrongs, we have to do something about it. And the first thing that we have to do is realizing that we cannot not act. Because of our massive influence on the planet, even as we just sit here sipping our coffee, we are acting. If we decide not to manage a piece of land, we are making a positive choice about that piece of land because we can sit there and not manage, and all the other drivers of the Anthropocene will continue to act upon it. The climate there will continue to change. The propagules from outside will continue to press in. The land use change around it will continue to affect all of the species that have ranges that overlap. So not acting, not managing, is a form of action. I put this slide of the hermit because I think that there's a really understandable impulse to want to, when you see the scope of the Anthropocene and all the changes that we have made and how badly many of them have gone, there is an impulse to withdraw. This was recently articulated in a very poetic way by a guy named Paul Kingsnorth, who wrote in the January-February issue of the Orion. His essay was brought to my attention because he talks about me in it. And he sort of admits that environmentalism isn't really working, and so his solution is to withdraw. He says, withdraw because refusing to help the machine advance, refusing to tighten the ratchet further, is a deeply moral position. Withdraw because action is not always more effective than inaction. So he has this scythe. He likes to scythe grass. He finds it very soothing. So his solution is basically to go scythe and to not participate in anything bad, just to withdraw. But I'm here to tell you that in a world of 7 billion people, where we've already changed the climate, all this stuff is in motion, these species are moved around, you can't withdraw. It's not an option. It is, and nobody can even really effectively pretend to withdraw except maybe Paul Kingsnorth. Where are the other 7 billion people of the planet going to withdraw to? Are we all just going to equally spread out over the planet and start scything and just go back to being hunter-gatherers? The carrying capacity of the Earth for hunter-gatherers is not 7 billion. We cannot withdraw. It's amoral to do so because we have set these forces in motion and we now must take care of the rest of creation as they unspool. So, I think the humble position is to realize that we're going to make mistakes and that we're going to have to try our best and that we don't always know what we're doing, but we have to try. Thinking that we should and that we can freeze some ecosystem with some sort of historical primitive vignette of America freeze ray, I think that there's a little bit of hubris in that. Because why should we freeze it on the day, June 3rd, 13,000 years ago, or August 4th, 1491, or January 1st, 1850? These are our dates. These are not nature's dates. These are just when one group of people stopped managing and another group of people started managing. This has nothing to do with nature. This has to do with, this is our baggage. So I think we should leave that baggage behind. I think in a lot of cases, the management proposed under this way of thinking is going to be pretty much very, very similar to the management that would be proposed under a more conservative way of thinking. In a lot of cases, it's going to involve protected areas, corridors, trying to stop poaching, all of the tools and techniques that we currently use. But it's a psychological shift. And one of them is realizing that intervention is not bad by its nature. We're going to have to do a lot more of it if we want to save things, so we better come to terms with it and start doing it with joy. Luckily, we are born interveners. Well, and this has been unlucky for us and for many other species. But what we need to do now is turn our instinct to intervene in nature to the good. So, fiddling, right? Here's the spiral jetty in the Great Salt Lake, a huge example of our need to fiddle and our quest to fiddle and intervene and touch and interact with nature in a way that is helpful and not destructive. And I see this impulse everywhere. I see it right outside of, right a few miles from here when I was hiking last summer outside of Boulder. I saw that somebody had made this very similar form with quartz just by the side of the trail. Now, presumably, whoever was hiking there partially because they like to see nature in its unaltered form. They like to go out where people are not intervening. But they still can't stop themselves from intervening because they want to participate, they want to touch. And so this instinct to touch and participate and to gather mushrooms and to hunt and to make little forts in the woods that we have as children, we need to sort of find a way to make that fiddling instinct turn into positive, thoughtful, caring intervention and not into destructive intervention. So my daughter has also taught me this. She's 3 years old now, and her way of touching nature is to collect it. She can't just see nature out there and think that it's beautiful. She has to put it in her basket and take it home, and it ends up in the couch cushions and all over, and there's leaf mold in the corners of my house. But it's clear to me that she is going to have a more meaningful relationship with nature if she can pick it up and put it in her little basket than she is if she has to stand there with her hands in her pockets and not touch it. So I am just proposing that we try to take this kind of instinct and put it to the good. We may have to move species as the climate changes. We may have to use breeding programs. We may want to use reintroductions. We're already doing all this stuff. We might want to add species to ecosystems to fulfill missing roles, such as seed dispersal or grazing, even if they're not the original species that carried out that roles. I think we need to research genetic manipulation. So it may hold the secret to feeding a lot of people with also having room for the rest of the species. I know that's not an opinion shared by everyone, but I hold it. And I do think we need to keep the genes of all the species on the Earth on our computers and in our freezers in case the worst should happen. And we need to at least hold the memory of them and the information in their genes safe. So Paul Kingsnorth says that he ends his essay by saying that he's going to take his scythe and he's going to walk ahead, following the ground, emptying his head, managing the land, not like a god, but like a tenant. And this stopped me because I understand that we don't want to manage like gods. We're not gods. We don't know what we're doing. Maybe we're like the Greek gods, right? They're always screwing up and making mistakes and having sex with mortals, and yeah. But I don't think we should act like a tenant either. I mean, I rent, and I'll tell you, I would not want to have the Earth populated by 10 billion tenants. You know, you want somebody who's got a house-proud investorship in the Earth. We don't want to just stand there and drink the coffee and look at the water damage on the wall the way I do every morning. We want to be out there trying to make the Earth more wild, more diverse, more beautiful. So that's my message. Intervention is. We cannot withdraw. We must manage. We must decide consciously not to manage and realize that doing so is a positive act. And we must try to get as much conservation value as we can out of every scrap of land and sea. Hopefully, the next generation will love nature and love ecosystems as much or more than we do, but they will not love them as dioramas, as static entities. They will love them as the dynamic creatures that they are. Thanks so much.
morning. I'm Jerry Mitchell. I'm on the board of the George Wright Society, and I'm going to moderate this morning's discussion. But first, thank you, Ellen. Very good thoughts, very helpful, thought-provoking. Undoubtedly, people in the room who have new things to think about. Some of you probably find yourself thinking, I agree with this, need to think seriously about it. Others may think I don't, but you still have important things to think about. All of that is good, and hence why we arranged for these two discussions we've had the last 2 days. Again, thank you very much, Emma. Very good, very good. This morning's discussion was going to be moderated by David Graeber, the chief scientist in the Pacific West region, and because of the sequester, he was not able to make it. He sends his apologies. He did share with me a couple of questions just to help get things started this morning. He did a review for Emma's book that some of you may have seen with the George Wright Society Journal. And I think I will first describe what we're going to do this morning. As yesterday, we've got microphones set up here in the center aisles, and I invite you to come forward and share your question with Emma. And we also have people that are joining us online. And we've made arrangements, as we did yesterday, to accept those questions. And we'll bring them into the discussion in the same way as yesterday. Alternating back and forth, I'm going to start with a question that I received from Dave Graeber. And I've got several more if things move a little slowly, but I think I'll just use one at present and see. What role do you believe parks and other protected areas should have in the coming century, in the context of the things that you shared with us this morning?
Well, this little metaphor that I used in my book, which I was quite pleased with when I came up with it, is that protected areas and parks are like the center of the rose, and then you have this system of radiating petals coming out, which are non-protected areas that we don't just give over to concrete, that we try to get some use out of as corridors or some level of biodiversity. But that they will function, obviously, as huge anchors, right? But then as things move around from climate change, you can imagine them almost sort of being like little nodes in a network, and that is what I'd really like to see, is protected areas having such great connectivity that they become the background to our lives, right? That our sort of human places are like little islands in a sea of interconnected protected area. Maybe a little bit ambitious, but why not? And of course, protected, it's nice to have lots of different options for what your level of protection is, and I think that people who've managed land for thousands of years have realized that this is successful to have some places where you hunt and some places where you don't hunt, and different rules like that. I certainly see a great usefulness in having lots of areas where you can do things like hunt and fish and gather mushrooms and do other kind of touchy-feely activities, because I do really think that those help people a lot kind of have a relationship with nature. So the one thing that I also see for protected areas is that some of them maybe become this sort of more fluid node in this network, but then some of them, we're going to want some of them to be a little more static. And not because a certain date is right for nature, but because it is right for us, because it does have cultural meaning or resonance. Certain ecosystems, certain groups of organisms have importance to us, spiritual importance to us, or historical importance to us. So in Hawaii, for example, it's going to be very difficult it would, I think, arguably impossible to remove all the non-native species from Hawaii, right? But I certainly think it's possible to carve out very small postage stamp size areas that only have native species, and that these would be of great value to the school children of Hawaii to learn about their heritage, their sort of biological heritage. So I think that you're going to have different goals for different spaces, but it doesn't mean that you're not allowed to have historical preservation as a goal. I just think it's going to be so expensive that we're not going to be able to do it for very, very large areas.
Thank you. I would invite you to, any of you that have questions, go ahead and move to the microphones. in the center aisles. Yes, sir.
So my name's Terry Young. I'm a professor at Cal Poly in Southern California. I want to ask you a question that I get asked by students pretty regularly, and that goes back to the question of guidelines.
Of what?
Guidelines.
Ah.
You were saying there is a instinct in us to touch things and stuff like this. I would tell you that there is also to some degree a desire for people to have some guidance.
Yeah.
I think one of the appeals of using baselines based on ecosystem models and things like this is you can at least say, well, this is the way the systems work on their own. But we also have people who, ask for the 10 Commandments. It's not just simply in the arena of nature. And the metaphor of the garden brings in culture. And you and I live in modernity, which is a culture of constant change. We don't have the traditions. This is Michael Pollan's argument. We don't have the traditions to hang on to the same way so many other peoples in the world do. And then the question becomes, well, what are the guidelines for the gardens? I get asked this. I mean, I teach in a program about regeneration and sustainability, and the students constantly ask me this because I very much share your opinion in a lot of ways and your view. But they're like, well, what do we base it on?
Yeah, sure. This is I'm just thinking that this is the dunk tank problem. This is where people feel as if my book has been like the ball that drops them into the water in the dunk tank. They suddenly feel completely at sea and there's nothing to kind of hook onto. And I think that it's actually, in some ways it's not a new problem because when we have looked to the past more traditionally, we still have to decide which past to look to. Mm-hmm. So if you're in Hawaii, you have to decide whether you want to look to the pre-European past or the pre-Polynesian past or, how far back you want to go, right? So figuring out what our goals should be has never been easy, and it's always been culturally loaded, and I think it will continue to be. So I don't think that there's one right answer. Oh, I hate saying that, but it's so true. I mean, I think that for every space, there's going to be a different setup. And what you say about traditions, I think, is interesting, because I think that, okay, so there's do you guys know of the American Prairie Reserve in northern Montana that Sean Garrity and some people are putting together as like a private initiative? And so if you go to his website, all of his materials talk about the time of Lewis and Clark, and this is sort of what they're hanging their project on, is they're going to make it look like it did when Lewis and Clark came through. So I was at a conference with Sean, and I sort of said, well, why Lewis and Clark? That's just some random time between two management regimes. And he's like, well, we write the checks. So I kind of found that refreshing, in a certain way. Like what we need to just sort of face up to is that the people with the money and the power are going to have a lot of say on what the goals should be, and we need to be able to fight that when those goals are not shared by a broader spectrum of people, right? But obviously Lewis and Clark is a pretty good mother and apple pie goal. But what's interesting is that when I challenged him on that, that it's not like this pristine nature state, he's actually started talking now a little bit about how one of the goals of their project is to bring back the management techniques of the Indians, that they want to manage like it used to be managed. So what their goal is now is not a pristine wilderness that Lewis and Clark saw. It's a really long-term workable management regime that it would make sense to perhaps return to and to try to think about using again. So I think that looking at management regimes that lasted for hundreds of thousands of years and saying, well, that seemed to work pretty well, might not be such a bad idea. Using history as a guide of what's workable, what's the spheres of possibilities, I think is totally appropriate.
Okay, thank you.
It's a little bit rambling. I hope that worked.
Thank you. Let's take one from our online guests.
Yeah, we have one from Richard Evans. The subject line is global trade and rates of invasions, extinctions, and ecosystem transformations. The question is, do you think we should work to reduce introductions of alien species by increasing regulations on global trade and transportation?
Yeah, the short answer is yes, right? So my feeling about non-native species tends to be that You have to look at the species in the context of your goals, and if it's getting in the way of your goals, then go for the herbicide, go for the flamethrowers or whatever else you need. And if it's not in getting in the way of your goals, then let it be. But of course, we're really bad at figuring out what new species are going to do when they show up. I spent some time looking at the different models and heuristics that people have developed to try to predict what's going to go invasive when it shows up, and I don't think that our batting average is anywhere near where we would want it to be. So I think to err on the side of caution is certainly to try to massively reduce new movements. Oh, we have not got a handle on the ones we've already got, right? You know, maybe you can imagine some science fiction future 1,000 years from now where we would intentionally move a species from one continent to another to fulfill a vacant role or to play an important role in an ecosystem that's changed a lot. But I think that our level of competence needs to be upped significantly before we start doing that. I think we better just work with the craziness already on our plate. Does that make sense?
Okay. Thank you. Bob?
Hi, Emma. My name's Bob Winfrey. I'm a science advisor from Alaska. And I recently organized a series of workshops across Alaska to help people develop scenarios for what may happen with climate change in the next 20 to 30 years in Alaska. I've just summarized that information. I'm presenting it this afternoon. But one of the interesting things for me is I went through 750 implications that people had and looked at the tone of the implications. Only 5% of them were neutral or positive. 95% were very negative. Among the positives was, well, we may lose our traditional hunting species. On the other hand, bison may move in, or whatever. Do you have any thoughts as to why it is so difficult for people to look at change in a positive way?
That's really interesting. I often say that the only baseline that a non-biologist cares about is their own childhood. And I think that when we look around as kids and we sort of get a sense of what organisms are supposed to be here, what plants and animals are here in my place, and how does this all work and how do they fit together, that sticks with us for a lifetime. And then when it changes, it's a profoundly emotionally wrenching experience. I could give as an example my own mother who lives in Seattle. Recently, she's seen a decline in slugs in her garden and an increase in snails, which she says are coming from California, because all bad things in Seattle come from California. And, you know, you would think slugs, snails, whatever, right? Like they're a bunch of slimy things. She is distraught that her slugs are gone and her these weird snails are showing up. People they find it deeply unnerving and weird and difficult when changes happen. And I think that this is something essential to the sort of how our sense of place. In a way, it's a testament to the fact that we are capable of developing a sense of place. You know, if we weren't freaked out about changes, I would worry more about us. So, you know, I don't have any easy answers for that either. I would be very distraught if some of my favorite ecosystems in the Pacific Northwest changed radically, if suddenly we lost some of the species that I love dearly. And I don't have easy answers for how to do it emotionally. I think that it is good to talk about some of the positives. I think that there has been a cultural prohibition in any environmental group from ever talking about any positive outcome that is anthropogenic. And you can see why. You don't want to give people, you know, the idea that it's okay to run around and do whatever you want, you know. But I think that maybe it will help us a little bit if we talk about some potential positives. I say this tentatively because culturally I'm still nervous about it, to be honest, about saying, oh, well, hey, my crop yield is going to go up here or whatever. I mean, it still seems awkward to me. I don't have easy answers.
Yes, we have another from Charles Van Riper. The question is, what common ground do you see between what the first plenary speaker yesterday presented and what you shared with us today?
I think our common ground is larger than our points of dissension. Obviously, we both care, and everybody in this room, everybody watching, cares deeply about nature, the continuance of biodiversity into the future. We don't want to erode, we don't want to lose anything that we've got. We want to work hard to preserve. I think the main difference is so Jessica Hellman is a biologist at Notre Dame, and she does some research that would inform assisted migration were to come to pass. In particular, she works on Gary Oak savannas. So I was tagging along with her team and doing some reporting. And at one point, she is deeply ambivalent about the idea of moving things around. But she said to me, she's got a daughter, and she said, in the end, I think it matters more to me that these things will exist for my daughter to see than that they be in the right place. So I think it's merely a question of emphasis. My emphasis is on biodiversity and on all these other values that we find in nature, and in finding sources of joy and, well, his emphasis is on biodiversity and finding joy too. In fact, come to think of it, what do we disagree on? I guess it's the metaphor of the garden. I find it useful. I find the metaphor of the garden useful because to me it shows a deep integration with nature and a working with nature and helping things to thrive. I don't see the resulting garden as being a sanitized place or a place where there is no space for wild animals or for dangerous animals. In fact, I'm hoping that our garden will have more wild and dangerous animals, maybe even some from Africa. I'm kind of into that proposal. So I think it's a question of whether or not that we find the metaphor of the garden useful and how experimental we're willing to be in the pursuit of our shared common goal of preserving our natural heritage for future generations.
Before I take this question here, let me share another of Dave Graber's questions. It kind of somehow ties to this last question. What do you think of Michael Soule's notion of Pleistocene rewilding?
See, I love Pleistocene rewilding. I've got to hold myself back from getting too enthusiastic about Pleistocene rewilding. I'm ready to start tomorrow. I want to see this stuff before I'm gone. So yeah, I think that, and I'm interested in many proposals for Pleistocene rewilding involve bringing proxies in from other areas, and that's bringing in a non-native species, and that's a bold move. Obviously, we need to consider it incredibly carefully, but it's very much of a piece of what I see as the kind of tools that we might look more to in the future.
Emma, I want to thank you very much for coming here today, and I very much appreciate your firm grip on reality. The title of your talk is Intervention Is, and I think that many of us here today recognize this reality.
Yeah.
Some have used this premise to argue that intervention is, and therefore we must intervene more in this era of change. And even you say that we have to try. But you also say that consciously deciding not to manage is a form of action. And I was wondering if you could clarify a little bit more for us, what are the benefits of non-action in an era of global change?
Oh, I'm glad you asked me this question, because then I could talk more about novel ecosystems, my favorite thing. And actually this comes back to this question that I just lamely didn't answer very well about what do you deal with the fact that people are very negative about change. Because after I finished, I realized that there was another piece to that, which is celebrating nature's adaptability. So when you see a flourishing area filled with non-natives or strange ecosystem forms that you're not used to, and you decide not to try to wrestle those back to what you're used to, but to actually let them go, that non-intervention, that non-management, I think is really important for three reasons. The first reason is that it gives us a sense of excitement, to see what happens with these new ecosystems, and to watch nature, and to kind of bask in nature's vibrancy and flourishingness. Well, anyway, nature will continue and grow and get huge and flourish if we let it, and it just might look a little weird. So letting these places go crazy will allow us to kind of bask in that. The second thing is we'll learn a ton scientifically from them as we see what plants work where, what species have new interactions with each other, how quickly, sort of populations, how their population dynamics change over time. All of these things might be really, really useful down the line when the climate has changed even more and we're faced with, for example, reclaiming a mining site and we don't know what to put in. And we've got some examples, and the ecosystem type that was there before was suffering and not doing really well. So what do we put in after, after the mining ends? Maybe we look at the ecosystem next door that's really flourishing. Maybe we don't carbon copy it, but we can take some lessons there. And the third reason that non-management I think is important is kind of a romantic one, but I think it's one that is important, is that it is wild, right? Like, these are self-willed spaces. They are figuring it out on their own without us fiddling around with them and removing things and adding things and culling herds and herbiciding things, and they're doing their own thing. And I think that it is just important to us as people that we have places on the earth that are wild like that.
Sure, I'll take it, even though you didn't point this direction. Hi, I'm Ken Klein from Bar Harbor, and like some of the other academics here, I've been struggling with some of the issues you raised for a while. And I think I'm reconciled to the notions of light gardening. The garden bothers me as a metaphor because I can think of gardens that are very much exclude the wild through pesticides and herbicides and weeding and straight rows. Mm-hmm. And I was sort of following your talk until you gave the Netherlands as perhaps an example of kind of that intervention and manipulation. And I thought about the Netherlands, and there's some very charming things about the Netherlands, but it's not really the world. That's not a great example for me. In fact, I think it's probably an example of what I'm most worried about, is that notion of intervention. The fact that we can't intervene means we should intervene, and gets back to your point of, well, we'll just go around doing whatever we want to.
Right.
And I'm wondering where you see the humility coming in. Like, again, the Netherlands isn't a great example for me in terms of humans' ability to stop that intervention. It seems like an extension of what you're saying really does mean that it doesn't matter, and that there's no recognition of the complexity of nature in the stuff that we do. We tend to have very simple, straightforward, interventions without that context. And I'm wondering if you see places where that comes from.
Well, I think that one answer to your concerns is scale. So the Oostvaarderplassen, although it looks very sweeping and kind of epic when you're in it in a Jeep, is, relatively speaking, a very small area. So you can see it as a pretty experimental situation, and and there's a fence around it. And it's surrounded by orchards and tulip fields, and so it's not. We haven't decided that we're going to take Kruger and do this there. So it's experimental, and I think that's one reason why I think, the Earth seems smaller every day, and we feel like there's tiny scraps of land that we're fiddling with, but there are still, I think, there's room for experiments, and I think it's wise to experiment because it's just like a divestment strategy. We're not sure in the long haul what kind of tools or approaches we're going to need. So in the short term, we should be doing at least some experiments with some of the more radical strategies, so that if the day comes that we need them, we at least have some experience with them. So I think that the way that it works for me is that it's an experiment, and that it's not the entire country. The other thing about it is that if Franzar had not fought like hell for that piece of land, it would have been an industrial site today. So what I think is important is that in places that don't have a chance of regaining some sort of pristine-ish or natural-looking condition, that if we just hand those over to the forces of development because they're not good enough for us, we're giving away too much. We need to hoard those places too, and then we can run these exciting experiments on them. I'd rather have a bunch of horses and cows running around than an industrial site.
Thank you.
Let me see if we have one online.
Yes, we have one from Jerry Freilich. The subject is sweating the small stuff. Question is, I appreciated your statement about the necessity of humility, but as an entomologist, I find the whole premise of moving things around ignores an understanding of how minutely ecosystems and their component species are interlocked together. Peter Kariva has argued that ecosystems are more flexible than we think. How do you view this question? My fear is that Peter is wrong, and that not only are we losing species, but that entire ecosystems will simply crash and stop working on global scales.
Yeah, Peter's point about the flexibility of ecosystems is one that I think is really intriguing, but I have not decided to sign up for it yet because I haven't had time to sit down. I mean, the amount of scientific research on both sides of that question is immense, and I think that I'm not prepared to come down on one side or the other on it. I just don't know enough on that particular issue. But the issue of moving things from the point of view of the little guys is definitely key, right? So you could move the pica, but then everything else in the system is going to get left behind. One thing that Jessica Hellman was looking at is trying to move more components of the system. In her Gary Oak work, she was thinking about, how would it work if we moved the Gary Oaks and all the little herbaceous stuff that grows underneath the Gary Oaks and the butterflies that have their life cycles on the little herbaceous stuff that grow underneath the Gary Oaks. And so she's looking at moving more components. So she's got a lot of work on butterflies and whether the different butterflies that are in the system would travel well and so on. I want to hurry up and say that she hasn't moved anything yet, so don't worry. So I agree that I think that moving things is a pretty radical solution, and it won't always necessarily work for the reasons that you mentioned, and it might be interesting to try to move larger suites of things if we need to, but then that's scary too because, okay, maybe the pica isn't going to turn into a crazy invasive, but maybe some little bug from its ecosystem will. And so these are all questions that need a lot of work. One thing I want to make clear is that I don't think we should go off half-cocked, but I think that it's high time we start thinking about these techniques.
Thank you for the very thought-provoking talk. My name is Matthew Browning. I'm a PhD student at Virginia Tech. And I wanted to follow up on some of the ideas about your time in the Netherlands. I recently had the opportunity to research land use in Sweden, particularly how land managers were letting children interact more with nature there than perhaps they do in the United States. And I was wondering if you saw, if we garden more in North America, like you suggest, if you saw parts of North America looking more like Western Europe in terms of land management, and if so, what do you think the implications are for the rest of the world's opinions of our National Park Service in the United States, which arguably could be sort of the flagship national park system in the entire world? Thank you. Sure.
Okay, two things. So one is when I say garden, I don't necessarily mean that we're going to start going out and planting things in neat little rows. I want to make that clear. In a way, the gardening thing is about acknowledging the situation that already obtains. Okay, Yellowstone is already a garden. It is already being managed on a day-to-day basis, and we are, the white bark pine program, they're trying to save the white bark pine there. There's orchards of the more genetically resistant ones. We are already intervening to the point where I think it verges on gardening. So if a garden looks like Yellowstone, I don't think it's going to freak people out too much because we're used to it looking that way. I love going to Europe and talking to them about how they do things there because it's so different than the way we think here. So in Sweden, they have these special forest parks for children. And some of them, they've got little paths and places for them to explore, places for them to also go off the path. But somehow they don't feel like it's enough to just let them go off the path. They also hide ceramic gnomes in the forests for the children to discover, which is, on the one hand, really cute, but on the other hand, do you really need the ceramic gnomes? There's lots of cool stuff there. Okay. Then apparently in the Netherlands, they have special parks for children to go off the path. And they've got some special name. But then all parks for adults, you must stay on the path, and that is the law. So there's this horrible situation where you're like a little kid romping free, swinging on the branches, and then you turn 13 or something, and they're like, now you must stay on the path for the rest of your life. And I find that really, we have got to make sure that there are places that we can go off the path all the way through our lifetimes. I think that's really important. I don't foresee the North American garden being populated with little tiny paths and little rows of things and garden gnomes. We can't afford it. It's not going to happen. So I think that we can retain our sense of rambunctiousness. That's why that part is in the title.
Online question?
Yes, we have one from Peter Dratch. The question is, Howard Zahniser, in championing the Wilderness Act 50 years ago, told those that would listen, "Let us be guardians and not gardeners." Are there some areas that are off limits to your experiments, like designated wilderness, like national parks?
Well, it depends on how you want to play it, right? So if you want to leave your designated wildernesses wild, then by all means do, but don't expect them to stand still. Expect them to change. They will change. Things will, your favorite animals will just walk right out of the park, and some weird animals will show up, and there will be some weird stuff growing there. When we go out and remove invasives, we are already gardening our wilderness areas and national parks. When we go out and do all of the management actions that we do in order to keep it pure, this is gardening to me. So I'm all for there being a good mix between this kind of intervention that, especially in the service of stopping extinctions, I think that's the sort of highest goal that personally I think we can shoot for, and letting things will themselves. But this is the big paradox that we have got to get our heads around. If you manage it, it can look historical. If it looks historical, it's not wild, right? So you can't have both. You can have historical or you can have wild, but you can't have both at the same time.
Good morning. My name is Marcelo Arce. I come from Bolivia. I'm a Fulbright scholar teaching this year at St. Francis University near Chicago. And I've been watching and I see how you're managing certain areas here. But I work mainly on the Amazon basin. And first of all, I really agree that we need to do something and not wait to have all the information to start having some action for conservation. But when you think about these big protected areas that we have on the Amazon basin that are really biodiverse, I mean, mega diverse, so it's huge what we're dealing with. But I come from a country that it's on the first positions on deforestation per capita. We're losing a lot of forest, and a lot of governments are thinking that that's the way to overcome poverty and to development. As they see the model that have been in this developed country, that you take all the forest down and now we have to manage that. And they see that that's the trail that we should follow. I don't advocate to that, but the problem that I see is when we're talking about gardening, maybe it's giving these people that think that development and throwing all the forest down and building a road and drilling all the oil and having mining in national parks and protected areas is giving them the possibility to address these issues. Okay, we're going to manage this thing later.
Right.
But there's not going to be enough species to manage. We're destroying that. So I know that we need to do those things. But how do we manage to convince this government, and I'm talking, I can see that it's happening all over South America at least, where I've been working in different countries on the Amazon basin. How do we deal with this government? Are we giving them arguments to do this kind of development that I don't really feel it's going to the right direction?
Yeah, so this is the second most frequent question I get about this work for a good reason. The most frequent question is, well, you say invasive species are okay, but I've spent the last 50 years pulling out blah, 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 and I want to keep doing it. And I always say, keep doing it. If it's your life work, keep pulling it out. But this is the second most frequent question, and it's a really important one. If it's the case that we can't go back and that historical baselines do not have this kind of moral power that we perhaps once thought that they did, then are we not giving arguments to the forces of evil and development? And the answer is, yes, we are giving arguments to the forces of evil and development, but A, you cannot pretend that historical baselines are morally salient and perfect Edens that we can return to if it's not true, because lying to people is not a long-term winning strategy for any kind of campaign. And two, they don't need that argument. They haven't needed it so far, right? We've been running around saying, no, you have to put it back the way it was, and they have paid no attention to a single thing we've said. So I really doubt that they're going to suddenly say, oh, we want to, do this mine, but I just feel too bad because we need to put it back the way it was when Lewis and Clark came through here. That's not, the previous argument that historical conditions are morally superior is not working. Therefore, removing that argument, I don't think is going to make a huge difference in the amount of... Now, having said that, this does mean that we're in a position, we environmentalists, and I count myself among you, and I don't hope they don't take away my journalist card, but there you go. We're in a position that if we would prefer to have an Amazon rainforest than a road or a mine, then we have to make that case on its own merits and without saying the Amazon is a pristine wilderness. Because, first of all, it's not a pristine wilderness. There have been people living there for gazillions of years, and they have planted things and moved things around, and they have fertilized the earth. And part of its beauty and its wonder and its diversity is that cultural heritage that's woven in there, like a little ribbon. So we have to defend the Amazon without this historical baseline stuff. But there are so many other reasons, the diversity that you mentioned, the beauty, the cultural significance. There are so many other ways to defend it that I think that we can get by without this histories as God argument.
Good question. Let's take a question online, if we've got one.
Yeah, we have one from Sarah Heiberg. The subject is citizen intervention versus expert intervention.
Oh, cool.
To what extent do you think that nature interventions should be reserved for multidisciplinary teams of experts and planned based on sound science and models versus engaging the public in the same vein of citizen science to accelerate the adoption of joyful intervention and owners rather than renters of the land?
Yeah, this is a really interesting question. I think I'm really grateful for it. So, on the one hand, the citizens are already way ahead of the experts on this. So, there was a cool study about plants in people's gardens, I'm bringing gardens again, in Europe. And they show that gardeners are doing assisted migration. People in Sweden are buying bulbs that used to only be able to grow in England and planting them in their gardens. And the ranges of common European horticultural plants have all shifted north over time. And, you know, one garden's pretty small, but when you add them all up, that's a pretty significant chunk of land cover. And, of course, in Canada, the Forestry Service, what's it called? They are already moving genotypes of timber trees north slowly. So the amount of crown land, I think, compared to the amount of parks land there, or maybe it's parks land, part of crown land. I need a Parks Canada advisor, clearly.
I think we can find you one.
But the amount of protected area compared to the amount of resource management timbered area, if they're going to be doing assisted migration, then that's going to happen, you know, whether we sign on as sort of experts or not. So who should be doing this, the experts or the citizens? If the experts do not do it in multidisciplinary teams, or if the experts do not advise citizens on how to do it in multidisciplinary teams, the citizens are going to do it by themselves. Already we have this group, the Toria Gardens down in Florida, that have decided that this species of yew called Toria taxifolia is not doing well enough in its little tiny micro range in Florida. It was probably a glacial refugia. It's unhappy. So they're moving it north. They're planting it in the Carolinas. That's already happening. People are already moving stuff north in their gardens, as I mentioned. Forestry Service is already moving stuff north. So on the assisted migration front, like, the experts are kind of late to the party at this point. But I think we need lots of expertise. These are very vexed questions. We don't want people just mailing stuff around, driving it around in trucks. We would like to at least have some kind of scientific input onto what's going on so we don't make a hash of this. So I think that it would be wonderful if we could get some expert advice. But I don't think we should shut the citizens out of this, because if you guys ever tell anybody what you do for a living, I'm sure that they say, what can I do to help? Like, how can I be part of the solution? People want to take positive action. And if you tell them one more time to buy compact fluorescent light bulbs, I think they're just going to throw the light bulbs at you. People want to be able to do something tangible. And if you say, okay, well, you plant this in your yard, or create habitat by doing this in your window box, or so on and so forth, then I think that people will get really excited about that.
I'm Tom Gilbert. I'm one of the founders and the first president of the George Wright Society. Your presentation and your answers to the questions were very thoughtful and inspiring. And I'm pleased that there is much common ground with Dr. Soulei's approach, the traditional conservation approach. my concern is that we're losing precious time. So I wonder if, for example, we could organize a meeting through an organization to brief key members of Congress and congressional staff. They're so uninformed and obstructive that if this is not done, we're going to lose a great deal of precious time. So I would propose that we have an inspiring session like this to try to educate some of the members of Congress and their staffs. Would you be willing to do this if we could organize such a meeting?
Sure. I have a string of pearls and pearl studs ready to go.
All right.
Absolutely. I think it'd be really interesting to see how policymakers at that level respond to these ideas.
Particularly on transboundary and transnational issues that we share with our neighbors, Mexico and Canada.
Yeah.
Thank you.
We're close to the end of our time. We're going to take... Okay. Okay. Our final question.
I'm Sherilyn Waddell. I live on the eastern shore of Maryland by the Chesapeake Bay. I've worked in historic preservation mostly outside of national parks for my career. And I'm struck by your image of McDonald's, your discussion of historic preservation, of the similarities of the discussions that were occurring in the 1960s and 70s in the area of cultural resources and historic preservation, and how we could protect the cultural heritage of this country while we were having similarities of, they weren't Walmarts yet, but McDonald's was the image of that. And how early on the concept was we should move historic buildings into a park, and that we could all go and see these historic areas. And now there are historic areas in their own right from Henry Ford. We had Williamsburg, huge discussion about a Victorian house that was in the middle of Williamsburg, and it should be destroyed because it didn't present the image of what the period of significance was for Williamsburg. Now we have historic districts in most of our major cities. We welcome new construction. And now we have heritage areas that connect these regions in our country. I'm wondering if there are opportunities for cultural resource managers and natural resource managers recognizing the obvious differences, but that there may be some aspects of this that might move the discussion forward.
Yeah, I think those are some really fascinating ideas. One thing, quick story it makes me think of is Earl Ellis, who's a scientist at the University of Maryland College Park and who works a lot on the Anthropocene and creating maps and giving speeches about, okay, everything has changed. Like, you think there's a savanna out there, but it's farms, you know. He lives in a historical district in Baltimore, and he can't change the shutters on his house because they're historically accurate. So while he goes on tour talking about the inevitability of change and embracing change, at home he's kind of in this historical preservation cultural framework. So I think that there are definitely some similarities and some interesting conversations that we could have about that for sure. Cool.
Thank you.